Hi, my name is Monica Hunter-Hart, and I am a reporter here at Forbes. I'm joined by Giacomo Tognini. He is my colleague, and we've done some reporting recently on Jared Kushner's net worth, so we're going to talk to you about that today. Welcome, Giacomo.
Hi, Monica. Great to be here.
So we just finished our valuation. We came to conservatively a number of 900 million. So maybe we can just start by talking a little bit about the kind of broad aspects of that valuation, and then we can get into some of the specifics and the private equity firm that he's been working on, which is kind of the most interesting part, in my opinion. So yeah, I guess there are kind of three broad buckets here that we're looking at. There's the kind of lump category of kind of art, personal real estate, and kind of other kind of cash and investments that we have estimated at about 150 million. Then we have his family's real estate firm, which he used to run, no longer does.
The Kushner Companies.
The Kushner Companies, exactly. Mostly have a presence in kind of New Jersey and the South these days, and the kind of Baltimore, D.C. area. And that we have valued his 20% stake in that company at 580 million. Mm-hmm. And then we have this very interesting private equity firm that he founded a few years ago called Affinity Partners, founded that in 2021. And that we have put at 170 million. He is the sole owner of the firm. So we were able to talk to Jared for this story. He told us a little bit about his kind of vision for Affinity. He actually has a lot of geopolitical goals for it that they're a bit of a continuation from the work he was doing in the White House when he was a senior advisor to then President Donald Trump. So he's hoping to really use Affinity to increase investment between the Gulf and Israel. So his investments kind of mirror that so far, at least some of them. And he was talking to us a bit about how he really wants to do long-term investments. He's not kind of trying to do Sometimes private equity has a bit of a reputation of kind of coming in, quickly rearranging things, making drastic changes at a company, and then exiting a stake quickly. But he wants to do much longer term projects, and some more real estate than is maybe common in private equity. So that's kind of an overview. But this is definitely not a typical private equity firm. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what makes Affinity unique.
Yeah, for sure. So like you said, it was formed in January 2021, so right as he was leaving the White House. And in the White House, like you said, he was working on a lot of different things, but one thing that he talks about a lot in his memoir and also sort of in the pitch deck for Affinity when he was first starting it was his work on the Abraham Accords, right? Mm-hmm. Which were these normalization agreements between Israel and the UAE, as well as Israel and Bahrain. And so when he went on and started Affinity, he brought together a very interesting group of investors. So they raised $3 billion ultimately. $2 billion came from the Saudi Public Investment Fund, which was the cornerstone investor. Huge investment for Affinity. And at the time, there were reports that basically the investment committee for the Saudi Public Investment Fund had expressed concerns about it because Jared Kushner obviously at the time had sort of very little experience in private equity. He had previously had a stake in his brother Josh's very successful venture capital firm, Thrive, and divested when he joined the White House in 2017. But he had little experience of this kind of private equity.
Oh, actually, on that note, maybe that's a good place to just quickly say, he's kind of approaching billionaire territory right now. He's 900 million and growing. He'll probably be a billionaire soon, per our estimations. If he had kept that stake in Thrive, he would already be a billionaire at this point.
Thrive was most recently valued at more than $5 billion. So we don't know his exact stake, but sort of any stake that we would estimate he had would have already made him a billionaire by now. But divesting that and going to government cost him that. He told us it was 4 years off from making money. But now with Affinity, he's sort of getting there again. And but to that point, the investment committee, the Public Investment Fund, expressed concerns, but ultimately the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman overrode those concerns and chose to invest anyway. And Kushner had built a close relationship with him. He's known as MBS during his time at the White House. That was $2 billion from the Saudis. Then they raised more than $200 million each from an Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth fund in the UAE, as well as a Qatari sovereign wealth fund. And then the remainder of the money, around $600 million or so, came from two investors. One we know the identity of, which is Terry Gu of Foxconn, which is the world's largest maker of iPhones, who Kushner also knew from his time in government and before, and then an unknown sixth investor.
Mm-hmm.
So with this $3 billion, the first year, 2021, 22, they didn't make that many investments. It was a time, obviously, of a lot of froth in the markets after COVID, very high valuations. But since then, we've seen the firm make many more investments. As of last month, they deployed about $1.6 billion of those $3 billion. They've invested in, everything from a fitness tech startup in Germany to, AI, data centers. They've made investments alongside the UAE wealth fund Mubadala in a fast food franchise operator in Brazil. But their two sort of most interesting and significant investments have been in two Israeli companies. Mm-hmm. Those closed, one in January of this year and one in July. Mm-hmm. They were, more than $200 million collectively. One is in the automotive and credit unit of a firm called Shlomo. The other one is in a publicly traded financial services firm, Phoenix. And what's interesting about them is that these investments mark the first ever time that we know, and that has been reported, of Qatari and Saudi investment in an Israeli company. Yeah. And this happened through Affinity. And Jared Kushner obtained carve-outs from both governments to allow him to do this. Mm-hmm. And he has said to us and sort of said publicly that this is a major goal of his, of fostering closer ties between Israel and Gulf countries through investment. Right. And these mark sort of a milestone in that. And they both came after the October 7th attacks last year in Israel. And when we asked him about this, he said that actually, the aftermath of that brought him closer to his investors. Mm-hmm. And the fact that he's able to invest their money in Israel still after that, to him, is sort of credit to his strategy. Yeah. However, going back to your point before, it is a very unusual firm. It's very new. It's only 3 years old. They only have one fund, this $3 billion fund, with a very concentrated group of investors. Yeah. 2/3 from one country, Saudi Arabia. Right. And it's sort of very rarefied group of investors, right? These mm-hmm. big sovereign wealth funds. And when we were trying to value it, because of that, it made it pretty difficult. Yeah. So do you want to say a bit more maybe about how difficult it was to come to a valuation of such a young and kind of unusual firm? Yeah. Well, I think also just important to say that I think the very fact of someone who, was creating a private equity firm for the first time, as you said, and had, little experience in this realm, receiving such giant paychecks or such giant investments was also remarkable in its own right. Makes it, all the more unusual. But yeah, it was really hard to value Affinity. We have a standard private equity methodology that we normally use here at Forbes, and we have a great, team of private equity kind of valuation guys that we work with who are really good at what they do, and they spent months earlier this year actually refining our method, as they do every so often in preparation for our annual Forbes 400 list of the richest Americans. And so we were all ready and set to use that method, but it turned out that basically because, this is a new firm, and Jared did not confirm to us whether he has plans to raise another fund, although that would be the kind of logical next step usually when funds have been maybe 75% deployed. We're getting close to that level here, right? Yeah. One would be raising a second fund. He's not quite there. So theoretically he would plan to do another one, but he wouldn't confirm that. And this is new. We don't know if there is the potential to do that again. We haven't seen any investment returns yet, so we don't know whether or not this is going to be a successful firm. It's just too soon to say. So normally when we value a private equity firm, we have we can basically bet that it is going to be continuing into the future, right? Raising new funds. Raising new funds, exactly, and kind of as one fund sort of expires, then the next one is sort of coming up, and it's this kind of recurring sort of effect. So that we don't have that ability to say that here, and so we decided to use
we had to kind of throw out everything that we typically know about how to value these kind of long-standing, well-established firms and create an entirely new methodology, which we came to with the help of many private equity analysts and investors into the stake investors into private equity firms. So maybe, I guess you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we talked to, I think, 7 different, private equity experts and people who, buy stakes in private equity firms for a living, like you said. And what we basically came to was a simplified discounted cash flow valuation. So, we know from public filings that the fees that Affinity charges to its investors, it's 2% for the non-Saudi investors, 1.25% a year to the Saudis on that amount that they invested. So we know they make about $45 million in fees each year. Affinity keeps about 15% of that. And then we basically projected that out to the life of the fund, which is about 10 years. When we were speaking to Jared, he said that the firm basically looks at a 7 to 10 year investment period for all its investments. So, looking out to about 2031 or so. And we also sort of estimated what the potential future returns would be. Obviously, because there's that 7 to 10 year investment horizon, we don't know when Affinity is going to be selling those investments and what those returns will be. Some of the companies it's invested in, for example, Phoenix, and then QXO, which is a publicly traded firm founded by the billionaire Brad Jacobs, which Affinity invested in July, and Jared is also on the board of. Those investments have done quite well, outpacing the S&P 500's returns since the summer. Others, like that firm they invested in Brazil, which is that fast food franchise operator, that stock has been quite down this year. So too early to see. But, based on the recommendations of these experts, we tried to sort of project out what could be the sort of current value of those expected cash flows. So, to make a long story short, it's a conservative valuation, right?
Yeah.
We're basically looking at, and also looking after taxes to what would be
Jared's
attributable,
take-home.
exactly, specifically to Jared.
Yeah.
Rather than what would someone pay to buy a stake in this firm, because to your point before, it's too young and sort of too uncertain. However, though, it was a very interesting reporting process. So, we can get a bit later to sort of how the election might impact it, but what did you find the most interesting about this firm? Because obviously, like we were talking about before, Jared Kushner likely would already have been a billionaire had he sort of not gone into government. He could have sold that. He could have kept, that stake in Thrive Capital, which he divested. And also, right before entering the White House, he was worth about $324 million. So, his net worth has obviously almost tripled since then to our estimate of $900 million or so. And in those previous 5 years, before he went into government, his net worth had already more than tripled. So, he's done well. Could have done better. Now we're looking at this firm. What did you find most interesting about it, about reporting on Affinity?
Yeah, so I mean, you're completely right. He's done very well, and he, gave up a lot to enter government, the Thrive stake, etc. He didn't take a salary while he was in government, but we are also looking at this interesting case of him being able to capitalize on his experience in government to now make a lot more money, and who knows how much that is going to increase in the future. Again, right now we have Affinity at 170 million, but it is kind of bringing up. It's become quite controversial, and it's bringing up these sort of ethics concerns that you sometimes see when people who were involved in the private sector enter government and then leave and enter the private sector again, and are able to kind of take advantage of either what they learned in government, the connections they made there, relationships, etc. And it's sort of brought up questions around that, and sort of is all of this okay, or if it is legal, should it be? Is kind of what a lot of people are sort of talking about right now. For example, we spoke to this woman, Virginia Cantor. She works for the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, so it's a kind of government watchdog.
The Chief Ethics Council, right?
Exactly, the Chief Ethics Council. And so she has been involved in this space for many decades. And she was saying that she's actually never seen an example of quite this kind of scale of something like this happening, which is basically, someone who was diplomatically involved with certain foreign governments at the White House, leaving, returning to the private sector, and then almost immediately being compensated with billions of investment from those exact same foreign governments. She said that she is completely unaware of anything like that ever happening to that degree. And so, you know, she was very clear in that, you know, this is not illegal. But she was saying it raises this kind of question of, well, if we are allowing this to kind of happen in our system, then we are potentially allowing for the possibility of a payoff of some sort of, she was using this word, payoff, to potentially happen where, you know, you're compensating, again, like someone who worked in government for potentially giving preferential treatment to those same governmental powers and then being compensated for that afterwards. Of course, Jared has very clearly told us that is not what's going on here. He says, you know, we followed all of the laws and rules that we were supposed to. There was no conflict of interest, and there is nothing that I did with any of the Gulf powers that was not completely in American interest. We should also say that his diplomacy often did break with the norms and traditions of American foreign policy, but he is very much in the camp of everything I did was in the American interest. Regardless, you know, people like Virginia Cantor have sort of been talking about, you know, maybe this isn't the kind of system that we want. Maybe we don't want to kind of create these incentives for people to potentially go into public office with eventual compensation in mind, or potentially to be influenced by foreign governments would be the kind of ultimate fear. She was saying that's the ultimate fear of, that was one of the ultimate fears of the founding fathers, for example, was this sort of threat of undue foreign influence on the American government. So I think it'll be interesting to kind of watch to see if we ever have new legislation around this. I think it's probably unlikely that we would see that under a Trump administration, at least as a direct response to what Kushner is doing. And we'll probably see less, I guess, congressional scrutiny of Affinity under this, you know, forthcoming Trump administration. There had been a kind of threat of congressional investigation up until now from Senator Wyden of Oregon and others. But I'm not sure we will necessarily see those go anywhere now that we know that Trump is going to be entering the White House. So maybe you could say a bit more about how Trump's election is expected to impact Affinity.
Right. And so I think last month, Senator Wyden and then Representative Raskin had signed a joint letter that they sent to Attorney General Merrick Garland, asking him to appoint a special counsel to investigate Affinity. Again, like you said, Jared Kushner has said that, you know, there's nothing in this letter and that there's no conflict of interest. And, you know, now with a incoming Trump administration, with a Republican Senate, and it seems likely a Republican House, probably there is not really any scope for any investigation of Affinity. I mean, even under the Biden administration, there hasn't been a formal investigation. And so when we were talking to Jared Kushner about this, we asked him sort of how does Trump's election, or at the time when we spoke to him was before the election occurred, how does the race sort of impact? And he said, you know, if Trump wasn't running, I'd be able to say a very clear plan for the next 5 to 10 years. But, you know, obviously with Trump's election, that could, you know, increase or decrease scrutiny. It's likely, obviously, that Trump coming into government will increase scrutiny on Affinity. Jared has said that he and his wife Ivanka, who is obviously Trump's daughter, won't have any role in the administration. But obviously he will remain a sort of trusted partner to his father-in-law. He and Ivanka were present at Mar-a-Lago on election night. And it's been reported that Jared also has close relationships with various people who are running Trump's campaign and who might now be in the incoming administration. And so he will, you know, according to experts we spoke to and from what's been reported, likely be a sort of sounding board as well without a formal role. And so that will increase scrutiny on Affinity in terms of whether a Trump policy could help or benefit Affinity. But obviously, given the Republican control of government, there will likely not be any sort of investigation incoming. Well, on the flip side, right, a Harris administration victory would have reduced the scrutiny because there would have been less, you know, reason to look into Affinity perhaps, but potentially more of a likelihood of an investigation. Now we don't have that. And then in terms of how it could benefit Affinity or not, you know, we think, and we said as much in the piece, that regardless of who won the election, Jared Kushner was likely to become a billionaire soon, given sort of the firm's growth and investments. And according to experts we spoke to, an election victory for Trump, which is obviously what happened, would be likely to benefit Affinity probably a bit more, given that if we're looking at the reasons why the Saudis, Qataris, etc., invested in Affinity in the first place, there was various theories. Jared Kushner said it's because obviously he had built a relationship with them and they believe in him and his ability to make these kinds of investments and make successful investments and generate successful returns.
Right.
He said it's a returns business, and he's confident they'll generate good returns.
Right. And even though, he hasn't done that in the past, they have seen him, he was saying, be successful in these other areas, so they're willing to bet on kind of Jared the man.
Exactly. But there's obviously also a question of, according to some other experts we spoke to, of, whether this could have been a bet on, Trump returning to office, which, at the time the firm was founded, it was right after January 6th. So obviously it was a time when many people thought that Trump was sort of dead in the water politically before he came back. Now, obviously, he's won re-election.
And even if Trump never returned to politics, I think it was very clear that Jared himself would still be a powerful, political and economic figure in his own right. His time in the White House only made him more of a kind of national power broker.
And so now that Trump is back in office, there's sort of a return to, potentially a return to the first Trump administration's policies towards the Middle East. So a priority at the time was a normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which ultimately didn't materialize and has been obviously made much more difficult by the war in Gaza and the Middle East. That's occurred since then. But if the Trump administration were to pursue closer engagement again between these Gulf powers and Israel, that would seem to be a positive for Affinity, which is pursuing those kinds of investments and is backed by those sovereign wealth funds, largely, right? There's other investors, but largely by those. And so when we're going back to talking about, will Affinity raise more funds, which we don't know if they will. From the reporting that we did, it seems that it's more likely that there would be an incentive for Affinity's backers to want to reinvest, given that, Trump will be returning and potentially pursuing these policies that in the first place, when Jared was working on them in the first administration, enabled him to set up this firm, right? And so obviously it's too soon to say. The Trump administration hasn't been inaugurated yet, and it's unclear whether it will pursue the same policies that they did with the Middle East, that they did the first time around, and whether they're even possible, right? That region has changed a lot since 2017. And 2021, obviously. But broadly speaking, we think that it's likely to benefit Affinity, making it more likely that it can potentially raise more funds if Jared chooses to, and that there could be policies that might be beneficial to its goal of increasing the economic ties between the Gulf and Israel and the Gulf and the U.S. So he's likely to become a billionaire regardless, but we think that it might make it more likely that he gets there sooner rather than later.
Right. Well, thank you so much for coming in today to talk about this. It was a pleasure reporting on it with you.
Yeah, it was great to be here and reporting on it with you too. Thank you.